Warbringer, a Twinborn Chronicles short story. Written by J.S. Morin. Narrated by Michael Naramore. A bellowing cry echoed through the forest, cut short by a sound like a butcher's cleaver biting into a carcass. The last of the ogre band lay still, porcupined with arrows and gashed with shallow wounds. It had taken one last heavy blow to the throat before the brute would lay silent. In its death grip, it still clutched a club that was little more than a log stripped of bark and carved with primitive icons. It was caked with human blood.
"I never thought we'd hear the end of that one," said Sir Polter Joram.
The Cadron knight put a booted foot to the ogre's head for leverage and tore his sword free in a spray of warm blood. There was a chorus of good-natured chuckles, the sort born of relief rather than humor.
"All in route, sir,"
one of the conscripts spoke up.
"Neither will Gary, Lowson, Sir Davrit—" "We all know the brutes took a heavy cost from us," Sir Polter cut the man short. "No use mourning while there's still work left to be done. It's 3 days back to Weiselton, and until then, any tree might harbor ogres."
"Sir, I only count 6 ogres dead," Sir Brannis Solaran called out from the edge of the battlefield. The youngest knight on the expedition jogged over to join the main group. "There were 7 at the start."
"You certain, Solaran?" Sir Polter asked.
There were mutters among the soldiers and knights, each man questioning his own assessment of the war party that had attacked them. "You always wondered what they taught me at the academy," Sir Brannis shot back. "I can count as well as any sorcerer." Despite the grim news, a few chuckled at the joke.
"Got me,"
Sir Polter muttered, before raising his voice to bellow his order,
"Bring the hounds! We've got an ogre to track down!"
Brannis rushed over and grabbed Sir Polter by the shoulder. "Sir, we should head back for Weiselton. That ogre has plenty of lead on us. We should—"
"Shut up and be ready to make haste as soon as those hounds find a scent," Sir Polter ordered.
Brannis glowered down at the senior knight, a full head shorter than him, but said nothing more. Long-eared and floppy-jowled, the hounds were not built to fight, but were ferocious trackers. In minutes, they had found the scent of the missing ogre and played out all the slack in their long leads. Their handlers ran to keep pace. The rest of the expedition was forced to run along as well. Already weary from one battle, men laden with chain and spear ambled along as best they could, grumbling to one another with any spare breath they could find. Knights in plate armor, bearing sword and shield, had a worse time of it, but bore the hardship with less outward complaint. Brannis counted himself fortunate. The Solaran family was as wealthy as any in the Cadron Empire, and his ruined armor was evidence of that wealth put to good use. The steel plates of his suit were thinner and stronger than those of his fellows, and lighter as well. Being only 22 summers' age, he also carried fewer years than the other knights, years that can weigh as much as steel when enough of them gather in one man. As he ran along with the rest of Sir Polter's command, Brannis wondered if any of them would survive. It seemed foolhardy to chase an ogre that had so large a head start, especially when they were so deep into the ogrelands already. The ogre was likely to find allies before the Cadrons found it. Sir Polter's plan seemed disastrous. The day that Brannis had learned of his assignment, he began a study of the ogres. He read a dozen books, everything that Cadron scholars had collected on ogre history, culture, and language. He spent 3 summers serving on the border of the ogrelands before Sir Polter had been sent to finish routing the brutes back into their forests. The hounds pulled them onward, lured by the scent of the ogre they sought, heedless of the dangers. The forest darkened and cooled as they went, owing to the deepening evening and the thickening canopy overhead. The longer they chased, the less their pace resembled a run. They slowed with the waning sunlight. The tireless hounds still led the way, but the men who followed had strung out in a line, sorting themselves by fitness and vigor. Brannis could have kept pace with the hunters who held the hounds' leashes, but chose instead to hang back in company with his fellow knights.
"Foolish pride,"
Sir Hoyland muttered loud enough for only Brannis to hear as the two trudged along side by side.
"You had the right of it. We ought to have turned back."
Brannis let the comment pass with a shrug. Boasting of his own cleverness would not reverse Sir Polter's orders. "If it was sickly or injured, we might have caught it by now," Brannis said. "No doubt that ogre is putting distance on us the longer we chase."
"Where could it go, though? There are no villages in this part of the forest," Sir Hoyland wondered. "We might wear through our boot soles, but we might get a chance to catch it if it stops for rest."
"We say there are no villages, but by what maps? 30 winters have passed since someone drew those." Sir Hoyland grunted in reply, not sparing the breath to argue. By the full fall of night, there was no question of continuing onward. The footing was unsure even by torchlight, and men were stumbling over roots and rocks. The hounds, dutiful creatures that they were, pressed on past exhaustion and were barely able to stand. Men with aching legs and grumbling bellies, grown bold enough to complain within earshot of their commander.
"Halt!"
Sir Polter shouted. He scowled about, blaming every malcontent who worried more about their comfort than of finding the escaped ogre. Sir Polter's gaze flicked past Brannis when it became clear the younger knight was not going to shy from his censure.
"Clear some of this brush and make camp right here. We press on at dawn."
Swords meant for parting flesh were set to hacking down underbrush. Cook fires sprang up at the edges of the camp as men sought spit-roasted quail ahead of sleep. Brannis watched as other knights enlisted the aid of conscripts in stripping out of their armor, but looked to no such help for his own.
"Sleeping in your armor, Sir Brannis?"
Sir Hoyland asked, punctuating his question with a chuckle. The older knight's mood had brightened with the exchange of the sword in his hand for a strip of salted pork, and of his armor for a light tunic. "If I sleep at all, yes," Brannis replied. "I dare say the ogres will keep away in the night, but I would not put a dawn raid past them. If I am to fight before dawn feast, I would prefer my armor over a bit of extra rest." Sir Hoyland shook his head.
"Lad your age shouldn't brood. You'll worry your way to an early death."
"I always thought it was the ones who worried too little who risked dying young." Brannis watched the fires as the night lingered. He sat with his back to a tree, fully armored except for his helm. Sentries were posted at all points about the camp, and ogres were creatures of the daylight hours, even more so than humans. Despite his mind's assurances that he was safe until dawn, sleep still refused to claim him.
"Psst! Sir Brannis!"
came a whisper near his ear. Brannis started, causing a rattling of armor that stirred a number of nearby sleepers.
"Sorry, sir. Here's something to help you sleep."
A water skin was pressed into his hands, but Brannis doubted that it contained water. He turned to see his benefactor and saw that it was one of the sentries, returning at the end of his shift. "Thanks," Brannis murmured. He lifted the skin to his lips and tilted it back, letting the wine within splash against his closed mouth. He drank nothing. He passed the skin back to the sentry.
"Just so you know, I've been talking around a bit,"
the sentry said, leaning in close.
"Something were to happen. You got friends."
Brannis gave a nod in reply, not knowing what to say to such a comment. He knew that Sir Polter's orders had been unpopular, but the thought of disobeying them or confronting Sir Polter in front of the men had not crossed his thoughts. Rather than reassuring Brannis, the sentry's words of support were the final arrows shot into his hope for sleep. Dawn came with a general sense of relief around the camp, but for Brannis, it only drew his thoughts down dark passes where ambush and traps lay in wait. He watched as the other knights took their dawn feast still out of their armor. Sir Hoyland, Sir Kinnan Sherborne, Sir Merrim Delway, and even Sir Polter, they all sought the comfort of their bellies before the protection of a good layer of steel over their vitals. There had only been 6 knights on the expedition, now 1 fewer after Sir Davrin had his skull crushed by an ogre club, but that harsh reminder of the dangers they faced had been dulled by a night's sleep and a fresh sunrise. As Brannis went to see about stilling his own rumbling stomach, he let his gaze wander the camp. Here and there he caught a man's eye and received a subtle nod in reply. The conscripts, more than the seasoned knights, had taken Brannis's example to heart. Most of them had their chain armor on and their spears near at hand. The bread in his hand had gone stale, as Sir Polter's mission had taken them longer away from Weisselton for longer than anticipated, but Brannis was too preoccupied to mind. Being deeper than he had ever been into the ogrelands had done nothing to change the birds' songs. The birds still sang their cheery melodies, somewhere unseen among the boughs above. They were repetitive but familiar. I wish I could just listen to bird songs and know that we were safe. Books of lore had told Brannis of many creatures that would scare common birds into silence, but ogres did not number among them. Ogres were a part of the forest, and no foe of birds. We came too deep, Brannis thought aloud. He stared off to the north, the direction they were bound to continue, should Sir Polter keep them to their course. Only a matter of time.
Don't let anyone hear you say so, Sir Brannis, Sir Hoyland spoke at his ear.
Brannis snapped his head around, not expecting to find the knight or anyone else so close.
Polter would have you up on reprimand, and have your sword from you. Be just my luck I'd have to lug that accursed thing around until we got home.
Brannis looked to his hip where Massacre was sheathed, its hilt and crossguard sculpted in the likeness of a dragon. Whereas his armor had been made for him upon his graduation from the School of Arms, the sword was a relic, an heirloom dredged up from the Solaran family's cellars. For the most prominent sorceress family of the Cadran Empire, a sword was hardly utilitarian. Massacre had been left unused for generations. I often feel the same myself. How many times does a man have to be sent off to hold a flank 10 paces from a friendly blade before he takes it personally?
We do the tasks we're set to, or that we're suited to.
Brannis bit his tongue before it betrayed him into questioning for a second time why Sir Polter had dragged them so far afield. It was neither a task they had been set to, strictly speaking, nor did Brannis find Sir Polter suited to it. The first sign of trouble came from the hounds. Sensitive noses picked up an errant scent on the wind, and a cacophony of barking alerted the camp.
"Arm yourselves!" Sir Polter shouted. "Watch the trees!"
With nerves frayed thin, and Sir Brannis's concerns aired so loudly the day before, most of the men were already following the order before it was given. The camp looked like a frenzied rehearsal for a military parade, with the donning of armor and the gathering of weapons as the primary activities. Brannis strapped on his helm, took his shield in hand, and was ready for battle. He looked to the dogs, and saw that the north was indeed their concern. He headed to the left flank to defend against a northern attack without having to be told. For good or ill, he knew Sir Polter well enough.
"Sir Merrim, Sir Hoyland, hold the right flank! Sir Brannis, the left!" Sir Polter shouted. "Sir Kinnan, with me! Spears, bracket the archers, and close ranks in front of them before the ogres engage!"
Bowstrings thrummed, though Brannis had yet to see the first ogre appear. Arrows whistled off into the trees. Optimism fletched with goose feathers. Brannis continued making his way along the left of the formation, trailing a line of spearmen in his wake as the Cadran force sought to keep the ogres in front of them and not allow them to surround them on all sides. So long as the archers were protected, holding the battle at the point of attack favored the humans. It had worked in their prior encounter the day before and left them with a pile of arrow-riddled ogre corpses. Brannis kept a hand to the hilt of massacre. He watched from over the top of his shield for the approach of his first adversary, and did not have to wait long. The ogres came into view among the trees, their tan skin painted mottled green to camouflage with the forest. Brannis could make no count of them. They shared no common dress. Most wore a loincloth and little else, but a few had boots or necklaces. One wore a helm made from the skull of some huge creature whose species defied Brannis's education. Each carried one of the fearsome carved clubs that, on this expedition, had ended a dozen Cadron lives already. Two of them caught sight of Brannis and headed in his direction. Brannis drew his blade. As Massacre slid free of its sheath, the reason Brannis was kept alone at the edge of the formation became clear. A greenish mist clung to the wickedly serrated blade and wafted down to the forest floor. The mist touched a fern leaf, which blackened and curled instantly. Brannis waved the sword, forming a lazing cloud that hung between him and the onrushing ogres. Among humans, Brannis was considered a large specimen, standing a full head taller than any of his fellow knights. However, as the ogres drew near, they loomed over Brannis. They stood head and shoulder above him, with room to spare. They were scrawny, but corded with sinewy muscle that bulged beneath their painted skin. The ogres came at Brannis from the left and right. They kept enough space between them that their clubs would be no risk to one another, but doubly dangerous to Brannis. Brannis gave ground willingly, taking several steps back and to the right. The ogre on his left hand walked into the cloud of pale green mist and cried out. Brannis waved his sword in front of him as he retreated, but the second ogre drew up short. "It burn!" the first ogre cried out. It dropped its club and waved its hands in front of it to disperse the cloud, but the ogre's fingers were blackening for its efforts. The second ogre watched the trail of fog from Massacre and kept a wary distance from it, using its club to fan the fog away from it. The ogre tried to circle around the pestilent barrier, but Brannis turned with the ogre and kept the fog between them. The other ogre, cradling burned hands, circled around the other side. Brannis whirled and closed the circuit, completing a thin, vaporous barrier all around him.
"Got him!"
the second ogre boasted, either unaware or uncaring that Brannis understood its language.
"Throw it!"
the injured ogre encouraged its ally. Brannis turned from one to the other and back. The ogre who still had its club was holding it aloft, trying to get a grip on it like a javelin. Brannis swallowed back a lump in his throat and stood couched, ready to dodge. The ogre hurled the club Brannis's way, though there was some chance that he might divert it enough with his shield to keep the impact from being lethal. Brannis had no desire to find out. He dove into the cloud of mist. The club missed, slamming to the forest turf behind Brannis with a terrifying thunk that well could have been his chest had he not judged the timing. The ogres erupted in spiteful laughter, thinking they had tricked the foolish human knight into his own trap. As Brannis regained his feet and closed in on the ogre who had just jettisoned its weapon, the laughter died away. The fog had left him untouched. The club-throwing ogre backed away as Brannis pursued, swinging Massacre to ward off any blows the ogre might think to launch. Bereft of a weapon, it seemed reluctant to engage Brannis in fisticuffs, despite a crushing advantage in size. Brannis drove it back, gauging the ogre's reactions and realizing he was able to steer the brute a bit as he goaded it.
"Get him away!"
the ogre yelled to his injured companion. Brannis spared a look over his shoulder and saw that the other ogre was trying to sneak up on him from behind. They were shockingly quiet creatures for their size, something Brannis had never been able to reconcile. He could hear the ogres engaged with his comrades, but not the one 3 paces away who was creeping toward him. Brannis lunged for the ogre he was harrying, causing the creature to stumble back into a tree. He then spun to face the desperate rush of the ogre with the blackened hands. Those maimed hands batted at Brannis, who took the blows against his shield, knocked off his balance by each, but not losing his footing. The ogre sensed that he was not going to overcome Brannis with fists alone and kicked out at him. Brannis tried to angle his shield down to catch the blow, but the ogre got beneath it and drove its potato-sized toes into his midsection. Brannis was taken from his feet, feeling the wind driven from his lungs. He lashed out with massacre as he was hit. The serrated blade caught in the ogre's thigh and stuck there, pulled from Brannis's hand as he fell. Brannis's only thought was to get back to his feet before some brute with thrice his heft found an opening to step on him. He sucked air as he rolled to his hands and knees, still clutching the shield in his left hand by the straps. He saw the ogre with massacre in his leg and watched as the wound putrefied, bleeding black instead of red. Beneath the creature's skin, Brannis could see the darkened blood spreading, branching along veins and circulating throughout his body. The ogre screamed and thrashed until the black blood reached his heart and rendered him still. Human screams and the din of swords and clubs kept the forest from silence despite one fewer ogre. The other ogre had not been idle. Brannis was bowled from his feet as soon as he regained them. He felt like he had as a boy, playing in games of Yolter with lads twice his age and being on the small end of their roughhousing. He was pressed to the forest floor beneath a weight he could not hope to lift. Brannis's shield was pinned to his body. Had his armor been of mundane make, he might have already been crushed. He felt the ogre's hot breath over his face and down the back of his neck. It smelled of fruit and beer. With his one free arm, Brannis slugged the ogre in the throat, causing it to jerk back as it gasped for breath. He wriggled free faster than he knew he was capable of moving, fear lending him a desperate strength. He rolled out from beneath the ogre and scrambled to his feet. The ogre rose as well, trying to grab Brannis with one hand while cradling its throat with the other. Brannis ducked, but did not try to get away. Instead, he surprised the ogre by rising suddenly, shield leading. Brannis angled his shield such that it caught the inside of one leg and slid upward along the ogre's thigh, making an abrupt fleshy impact when that thigh ran its course. The ogre rose on his toes, shrieking at a higher pitch than Brannis had heard from an ogre's throat. Despite the disparity in weight, Brannis shoved the unbalanced creature off his feet. The ogre toppled to the ground, both hands cupped over his sensitive injury. Brannis had time to pull Massacre free of the dead ogre's leg, where the blade's foulness had putrefied the skin and sinew in which it had lodged. The pained ogre on the ground put up a hand to ward Brannis away, but Brannis hacked the hand away and plunged Massacre into the ogre's chest. It came away bloodless, with just a muddy black ichor that fell away from the blade. Brannis paused to catch his breath. He had received no aid during his battle, which he took as a bad sign. He heard the fading calls to regroup. It seemed that while the left flank held, the Cadron force was fighting a slow retreat everywhere else. While Brannis had no clear count, he could tell that there were over a dozen ogres still battling. It was more than double the size of the force that had tested them sorely just the day before.
I could flee.
Brannis's feet began carrying him in the direction of his fellows.
I'm only a day from the woods, I know well.
He sheathed Massacre at his side, mindful of the magic's limits as he sought to keep its fog lethal for as long as possible. Someone ought to get to Weiselton to report what happened here. Brannis kept his head down and tried to keep the trees between him and the ogre raiders as he approached.
Just what sort of fool am I?
Brannis came across a body, one of the conscripts, though identification would have required more of a head than the corpse was left with. Others were strewn about, and the growing realization of the rout crept over Brannis. He recognized Sir Kinnan by his armor, sprawled face down with blood running from the joints. He saw Sir Polter, the left half of his armor flattened against the forest floor. Brannis knew then that all thought of running was moot. They were his men. Though the remaining knights had seniority elsewhere, if Sir Hoylan or Sir Maram even lived, Brannis had been longest station at the Weisselton post. Brannis gained ground on the Cadron retreat, so there was at least still a battle ongoing, not outright flight. He came across more bodies en route to join them. A few were ogres, riddled with arrows, but most were Cadron.
Use the trees!
Sir Hoyland's voice carried over the clang of steel, the crush of ogre feet on twigs and roots, and the moans of the mortally wounded.
If we break, they will run us all down! Cowards!
Brannis shouted, but not to his comrades. He called to the ogres in their own tongue. You run from me! He drew Massacre and beat the blade against his shield. The ogres were only 24 paces ahead of him, in Brannis's paces, perhaps half that in the ogre's own. Several of the behemoths turned at Brannis's taunt.
Red Oak, go kill that one
of the ogres ordered, and another of the creatures broke off pursuit to head Brannis's way. Not good enough. One fewer will do them little good. Brannis let his designated opponent charge him headlong. He waved Massacre about in front of him and backed away, drawing the ogre into the cloud. The ogre's charge faltered as he passed through. His huge club wobbled in convulsing hands. Brannis deflected an ineffectual blow with his shield, more momentum than a proper swing. Massacre sank into the creature's side, and Brannis stepped aside as Red Oak fell dead. The ogre force was receding into the trees in pursuit of the Cadrons. Brannis needed something more compelling to get them to stop. He tried to remember all that he had learned of the ogres as a species. He turned to the dead ogre at his feet and had an idea. He raised Massacre and brought it down on the back of the ogre's neck with considerable strength behind the blow. The sword bit deep and stuck until the poison fog had decayed the flesh around the cut. Brannis pulled Massacre free and struck again, and the ogre's head rolled free. Brannis returned the gruesome blade to his hip. He would not defeat the whole of the raiding party with a single blade, even one as formidable as his own. He reached down and tangled a gauntleted hand in the ogre's hair. The head weighed as much as an ale cask, but Brannis was able to lift it. Grim fortune it was that Massacre's blade had gummed the bloody stump of the neck with rot. The severed head did not drip blood. "Weaklings!" Brannis shouted. He set off at as quick a walk as he could manage, holding the grisly trophy aloft. "Is this all you can send me? I challenge your chieftain!" A few of the ogres slowed. There was some conversation among them that Brannis could not make out.
Who are you?
One of the ogres demanded. "Call a truce! For the challenge!" Brannis shouted back. To the Cadron force he ordered, "Come around to me! I am parleying!"
Who are you?
The ogre repeated. "I am Sir Brannis Solaran, Knight of the
That is no name,
the ogre objected.
It tells me nothing. I am Rockeater, leader of this raid. Do you have a name you could make challenge with, human?
Rockeater, Red Oak? No, Red Oak. I need an ogre name. "Call me Warbringer," Brannis answered. "I am a killer of weak ogres." As Rockeater and his ogres approached, Brannis threw Red Oak's head at the raid leader's feet. It was a sign of prowess, a boast to show that he was worthy of offering a challenge.
"Tenwolf is no weak ogre,"
Rockeater replied. It was not a refusal, Brannis noted.
"No more this,"
Brannis said, gesturing to the fallen, ogre and human alike. He knew no ogre word for slaughter or carnage. The ogres had few words, and fashioned more complicated concepts by piling them up. Brannis risked no mistranslation by inexpertly combining words.
"I fight Tenwolf or his champion." "What are you saying to the beasts?"
Sir Hoyland asked as he headed up the group of survivors that rallied to Brannis's call. "Trying to settle this by single combat," Brannis replied, only turning so far that he could still look Rockeater in the eye. "Maybe we can get out of this without any more losses."
"Warbringer, you give fair challenge,"
Rockeater proclaimed.
"Come with me."
Rockeater turned and began walking north. After a moment's hesitation, Brannis followed along. Sir Hoyland gestured for the rest of the cadrons to follow along, but Brannis noticed and stopped him with a warning hand. "No, just me. They would never let you all near their village armed, and I doubt you would want to go there unarmed. If I fail to return, just think of something. Do your best," Brannis said. Sir Hoyland nodded, but Brannis could see by the pained look in his eye that the knight had no hope for Brannis's survival. Rockeater set a punishing pace, his long legs carrying him as far with each step as Brannis could manage in 2. Still, the ogre looked back often to check on his chieftain's challenger. "Is he wearing me down before I fight? Or is this just the knight's lost sleep coming to call its debt?" It was an hour's walk to the village, as best Brannis could judge it. He was astonished how close they had come to stumbling into it on Sir Polter's mad chase. For all his books and his summers spent on the border, Brannis had never laid eyes on an ogre village before. The ogres had made a clearing on the bank of a stream, cutting down the trees and replacing them with structures that were halfway between tents and domed huts. Smoke rose from many of the tent huts, carrying the scent of cooked meat, reminding Brannis's rumbling stomach how long it had been since he had eaten real food. Ogres stopped their daily work and gawked at him as Rockeater escorted him to the center of the village. There was a large dirt common area devoid of structures. As Brannis arrived, it was filled with ogre children, near to his own size, wrestling and fighting with branch-sized sticks.
"Go, tell Tenwolf that he has challenge,"
Rockeater ordered one of the first ogres they met. Within the safety of their own village, the other ogres did not paint themselves to match the trees and bushes. The season was warm, and the ogres wore little, showing off their richly tanned skins. Though ogre skin tone varied, they never ran as dark as the Safshan, nor as pale as the Cadrons. Brannis waited under the many gazes of the ogre villagers, all watching to see what the presence of a human portended. He felt as if he had been reduced to miniature, a wooden soldier pulled from a child's toy box. He guessed that he was about to be played with, and roughly so. "I should have taken my father's advice when I was expelled. I could be lazing about Cadris right now, telling tales of how I would have been a sorcerer, but I just didn't have the source for it. Maybe Sir Hoyland will survive to speak well of me."
"Human!"
bellowed a ragged voice.
"Rockeater, why did you bring a human here?"
The oldest ogre Brannis had ever seen emerged from one of the dwellings. He had not been aware that ogre hair grayed like a human's, or that their flesh wrinkled and sagged from their bones. Tenwolf provided that evidence.
"He killed Small Raven and Mountain Thunder, and called us cowards. I sent Red Oak to kill him, and he killed Red Oak too,"
Rockeater said for all to hear. The ogres muttered among themselves. For an expert on ogres, Brannis felt lost among them, but he imagined that their tone sounded impressed.
He cut Red Oak's head and held it up and challenged you, Ten Wolf. He names himself Warbringer.
I see,
Ten Wolf said.
But why does this human want to challenge me? Rockeater is greater warrior.
You are chieftain, Brannis replied. He hoped it would be explanation enough.
I am,
Ten Wolf agreed. He raised his voice such that all in the village could hear him.
No one will fight this human but me.
The ogres that had gathered around Brannis backed away, leaving him alone in the village center with Ten Wolf. A young ogre brought Ten Wolf a carved staff, which was the only weapon the old ogre brought to the fight. Ten Wolf chanted something beneath his breath and twirled the staff in his hands. Brannis drew Massacre and strained to make out what Ten Wolf was saying. It was unlike any spell Brannis had ever heard while at the academy, or cast by any of his family. He understood the rune language nearly as well as his native Cadron, and far better than his clumsy understanding of Ogreish. Ten Wolf's chant sounded alien. The ground beneath Brannis's feet trembled. He looked down and saw shoots sprouting from the barren soil, lengthening, thickening, twisting at an astonishing speed. The tendrils coiled themselves about his ankles and worked their way up his legs. Tendrils whipped up and snatched at his arms, wrapped around his waist, sought his throat.
Sorcerer!
Brannis cried in alarm, not thinking to speak the ogre tongue. He shook Massacre about, seeding the air with a foulness he hoped could overcome plants that were born of the ether, not nature. Ten Wolf strode across the makeshift arena to the cheering of his people. The ogre chieftain held his staff thrust before him, poised to end the life of a trapped Cadron knight.
Look out! His sword breathes killing air!
Rockeaters shouted over the more general calls of support. The magically induced tendrils were hardier than the underbrush of the surrounding forest, but the fog from Massacre overcame them. Brannis struggled in the tangle's grasp until enough of it fell away from his sword arm to work freely. Then he cleared away the rest with little trouble. Brannis did as he had in his forest battles with the ogres and created a wall of that fog as a barrier against Ten Wolf's further advance. The old ogre stopped and looked at Brannis with a narrowed gaze.
Tricks, human. I have tricks for your tricks.
Again, the old ogre chieftain muttered syllables that held no meaning for Brannis. Ten Wolf took the end of his staff in two hands and spun it in circles overhead. A wind arose, blowing through the village. The fog from Massacre dispersed, and the persistent wind kept it from collecting in the air. Ten Wolf resumed his advance on Brannis, and Brannis retreated, knowing that he had only several steps before a wall of ogres cut off his escape. There was no choice. Short of his only bit of magic, Brannis would have to face Ten Wolf as an equal, warrior to warrior. Brannis left caution behind in his boot prints. He charged Ten Wolf. The ogre chieftain shrank back in surprise, taking a swipe at Brannis as he stumbled to defend himself. The blow clanged against Brannis's shield, but Brannis ducked and forced the staff to glance off high and over his head. Ten Wolf pulled back the staff and took a wide grip, barring Brannis's path to his unarmored body. Brannis slammed Massacre down on the staff. Once, twice, a half-dozen blows the staff took before it gave way. Thick as Brannis's forearm, the carved wood still could not bear up against the weight of his hacking attacks. Ten Wolf reacted with a warrior's instinct. Suddenly in possession of two smaller weapons, he clapped them together on Brannis. Brannis held his shield out to ward off one of the half-staves, and the other he made a choice to take on his armor. The second half slammed into his ribs, and only plates of ruined steel kept the blow from caving in his right side like a gourd. He used the opening to his advantage, reaching past the attacking piece of staff to strike at Tenwolf's wrist. The ogre chieftain cried out in pain. The piece of staff in the ogre's left hand clattered to the dirt. Brannis tried to press his advantage before the ogre recovered, or before the pain in his ribs reached the smarter part of his brain and told him to double over in agony. Tenwolf raised his foot, though, and caught Brannis in the stomach. Brannis collapsed to the dirt himself, but not before Massacre clipped the chieftain's shin. As Brannis rolled about, trying to suck enough air into his lungs to draw a full breath, Tenwolf hit the ground a few paces away. Though the wind still blew at the wisps of death that clung to Massacre, nothing could stop the direct touch of the blade from transmitting its deadly poison. Brannis somehow doubted so small a dose could kill a creature the size of Tenwolf, but the blows had struck deeper than the nicks he had inflicted. Shield forgotten, Brannis crawled toward Tenwolf, blade in hand. The ogre chieftain shied from the blade as Brannis approached and appeared unable to rise. Brannis swatted his way past the ogre's injured hand and knelt on Tenwolf's chest. Brannis held Massacre a hand's breadth from the chieftain's throat, the wind the only thing keeping the blade's proximity from killing him. Tenwolf looked up at Brannis with eyes devoid of fear.
Well fought, Warbringer,
Tenwolf said, loud enough for all to hear. I offer you trade, Brannis said, as much for the villagers as for Tenwolf's ears. Your life for my men's lives.
I cannot,
Tenwolf replied.
We cannot have you humans in our land.
Then I trade this too. No human enters the forest. No ogre leaves, Brannis offered. No raids. Tenwolf paused a moment, though whether indecision or drama was his goal, Brannis could not say.
It is a good trade,
Tenwolf agreed. Brannis returned Massacre to its sheath and helped Tenwolf to his feet. Cyrus Hinterdale awoke in darkness, an awful ache in his ribs. He knew he must have slept on just that one side. He fumbled for the bedside lamp and managed to get it lit, casting his little bedchamber in shadows. The wick's glow illuminated a small table set with quill, ink, and paper. With the practiced hand of a professional scrivener, he began jotting down what he could remember, letting the fragmented images go from memory to paper without stopping to put thought to them. It was fading fast, as his dreams always did. By the time it was gone, he had filled half a page. He looked down and read what he had written. Forest, spear, dogs barking, 10 wolves, fog. The list ran on, just fragments with no cohesion, no common element that Cyrus could use to rebuild his memory of the dream. It had all seemed so real just a moment before. Why could his waking mind not conjure such wonders? His daydreams seemed drab by comparison. He would have a story worth writing were he ever to keep the dream alive long enough to cage it on paper. With a sigh, Cyrus crumpled the useless notes, tossed them on the floor, and went back to sleep. Thanks for listening to this Twinborn Chronicles book. Don't worry, there are more demons and dragons and undead where this came from. To continue listening, search Twinborn Chronicles at your favorite audiobook store, or visit twinbornchronicles.com. This has been Warbringer, a Twinborn Chronicles short story, written by J.S. Morin, narrated by Michael Naramore. Copyright 2018 by J.S. Morin, Production copyright 2018 by J.S. Morin.